Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our penultimate event of today's fantastic Smashing the Silos series here at the Oxford Union. Now, Shruti Rajagopalan will be in discussion with former Nobel laureate, or I suppose still current Nobel laureate, Vernon Smith, who will be discussing the enduring legacy of Adam Smith. Thank you very much to both of you.
I am thrilled to have this opportunity to have a conversation with Professor Vernon Smith. Vernon, thank you so much for doing this. And I want to get right to it. You have written a lot about Adam Smith, and all of us simultaneously live in two worlds, which are governed by two separate sets of rules. One is, of course, the intimate order with our friends and family and neighbors and co-workers, and we may bring them coffee and cookies or thank them profusely when they bring us coffee or cookies. And the second is our participation in the extended order, where no matter how much I love my coffee or how grateful I am for it, I don't know who or how many were involved in producing it. And if tomorrow the coffee is no longer good or did not arrive at the right time, I don't think twice about switching to someone else for my morning coffee. But we don't switch partners or friends or spouses if the coffee is too cold one morning, do we? And so we simultaneously inhabit these two worlds. And there's also a conflict in simultaneously inhabiting these two worlds. What can we learn from Adam Smith about this conflict?
Well, Shruti, I think the first thing I want to note, see, the world, our intimate order of our family, extended family, friends, and neighbors is governed by rules. Rules are the caring, other regarding actions that we take in dealing with each other every day. And we've been brought up basically in a world that has involved a lot of social conditioning. That is the reason why that we're able to function quite well in that world. The other world, what Hayek calls the extended order of markets, is a world where, well, even the people we buy our goods from, like in the supermarket or the drugstore, they may change we don't always buy them from the same, we don't know those people. And we certainly do not know people all over the world are in the supply chains that bring those goods into the store, you see. So there's this huge, very impersonal world that we work with. And Hayek, you see, is warning us of the dangers of mixing those two worlds and applying. And he says we can crush the intimate order of family and friends if we try to apply the more self-interested rules of action that we find out in the economy. And similarly, we can destroy the economy if we try to heavily-handedly, you see, intervene and interfere with the desire of trying to apply policies and actions that may be suitable for our family, but not suitable for this impersonal world. And so it's interesting. You see, and Adam Smith wrote a book about each of these two worlds. And the first is Ethereal Moral Sentiments. And that book is about the origin and roots of our human sociability. You see that, how that arises up and how the rules that we follow are created out of our social experiences in these communities. And it's interesting because out of that, let me just speak a little more fully about it, kind of in depth as to how he looks at that world. And there's two kind of key propositions that come out of Adam Smith's thinking. And the first has to do with beneficence, and the second has to do with justice. Now, the rules that come out of beneficence are of the kind where, see, out of gratitude, we feel a compulsion to reward people who intentionally do beneficial things to us, you see. And, so I go into work and I put my trash barrel out because it's the day for the trash to pick up. I come home, I forget to bring it in. My neighbor brings it in for me. Well, a couple of days later, I see her, I thank her for that, and I give her some avocados I picked off my tree. This is a typical, you see, kind of example, the sort of thing that Smith is talking about, that I feel compelled to reward that. So that's beneficence. And you see, that feeds into his second book, The Wealth of Nations, because you see, beneficence is the source of positive reciprocity in our communities. And as Smith says, kindness is the parent of kindness in that world. Well, if you think about it, the world of trade depends very heavily upon gains from trade. We do exchanges with people because we both gain. Well, that's simultaneously, it's a mutual simultaneous benefit, you see, that we're experiencing. But it's simultaneous, whereas in the world of our intimate order, often I do something, a favor to you, and you maybe be days later, you do something for me. It's not that ordered and structured, but it nevertheless follows very identifiable rules. So, that's my beginning response to your great question.
So I want to follow up with a more concrete situation, which is, the global COVID pandemic that we have all been experiencing the last 11 months. So in one sense, we suddenly see a lot of confusion and conflict because these worlds are now colliding, right? And the way a modern economist would say it, it's because of the externality, which is the transmission of infection, that is causing some of these conflicts and some of these problems. But if we go back to the examples of how you would see it in a Smithian world, we see that people almost have these two sides. The same people who would go out of their way to protect an elderly neighbor or their grandparents and make sure they stay home and maybe even bring them groceries may also be the same people who we see in crowded bars, potentially participating in super spreader events or, hanging around without a mask. Is there a reason why these kinds of externalities may cause even further breakdown or greater conflict in the intimate and the extended order? Or have these rules broken down because the pandemic doesn't have a good precedent? And that's why the social norms and rules that Adam Smith talked about, especially in the theory of moral sentiments, they're not quite applicable to us in the last 11 or so months, and we're all, a little bit adrift.
Well, if you think about the term social distancing, that's completely contrary to the whole idea of human sociability, because human sociability comes out of our more intimate contacts and relationships. So it should hardly be a surprise, you see, that out of a world, this new world that's been thrust on us since March of last year is one that is severely limiting, you see, our normal free social associations. And so to me, it's hardly surprising, you see, that we have had an escalation of domestic violence. We have an increase in depression. We have an increase in suicides. All of these things are associated with that. Well, also, I think we have, let me speak a little bit about the second pillar of society. See, Smith says that the first pillar of society is beneficence. The second pillar is justice. And that's a world in which if someone takes an intentionally hurtful action toward us, we are out of our resentment for that, we tend to want to punish that, and we will punish it. And all of that kind of experience, you see, was important in developing the concept of property rights. See, property came out of that, where that recognizes that, first of all, you have property in yourself, and the product of your labor is your product. You have a right to that. So it comes right down very, very personal kinds of issues. Well, but that world that involves punishment can also escalate out of control. See, you don't have to worry about, when people trade favors, that escalating out of control. It's the downside, you see, that is more likely to escalate out of control. And I think that's one of the principles in Adam Smith that gives us some insights in what's going on during the pandemic, because there's a lot of anger out there. There's a lot of divisiveness, and it's getting expressed. And expression of anger are being or retaliated against, you see. And so we've seen a tremendous degree of stable social fabric as a result of this experience. We've been there before, so I'm not as concerned as some people that somehow this is going to be a major change in our future, because we've been here many times before. I'll come back to that maybe a little later.
I'm concerned about one aspect of the pandemic in particular. So the two conflicting, or rather simultaneous, emotions that humans experience. One characteristic of human nature is self-love, and the other, as you just discussed, is sociability. And when there is sociability, it in some sense tames some of the excesses of our self-love, right? It is through the sociability and the socializing with others that we can tame some of our more excessive, rather selfish behaviors. But my sense is, because we have been so cut off from this kind of sociable environment for a long time, are some of our excesses going to get out of hand? Are we going to really have to relearn how to live in society? Right? Just a simple example of students in a classroom. Are they going to have to relearn how not to talk over each other in a classroom because they haven't been in one? And Zoom gives us the option of muting anybody at any point in time with a click of a button. And so those are the sorts of things that I feel, there might be, it might be slow to get back into action.
Well, yes, I think we didn't immediately adjust to the pandemic when it started. That took quite a bit of time, and I think there'll be a similar transition when we go back to a more normal world. But I think, you see, in Adam Smith's concept of justice, and in fact, in his first book, The Ethereal Moral Sentiments, the foundation of that is that the first principle or the first axiom is that we're all self-interested, strictly self-interested. Well, at first sight, that sounds like it contradicts the fact that we end up with these other regarding rules. But so, and I think that's, there's a quotation that I can paraphrase from Adam Smith, in which I think that sheds light on that. He says that although we are all strictly self-interested, we can't look our neighbor in the face and avow that all our decisions are based upon our self-interest. So in other words, what does Adam Smith do here? He distinguishes between being self-interested and acting in your self-interest. Now, and he nowhere writes this down in a very simple, straightforward way, but you can put it together from his examples. And that is that we all need to have common knowledge that we're each self-interested. Otherwise, we don't even know what benefit and hurt is. Yeah. You see, so if I undertake an action that makes you worse off and someone else better off, all observers, you see, and worse off, if it's I suppose it's an experimental game, you earn less money and someone else earns more money. So imagine a world like that in these experimental games. Well, unambiguously, we know the person that got less is worse off and the person that got more is better off. Well, and then that knowledge feeds into these rules, you see. They are the inputs to the rules. And so, and in fact, if there was any ambiguity about who is hurt and who benefits, you see, then what act to take becomes very ambiguous about and becomes, it's not clear, in fact, what these rules that Adam Smith is talking about even mean unless everyone is self-interested. So that, interestingly, you see, makes his first book and his second book understandable in the same underlying, in terms of these same underlying axioms. And so now on the pandemic, of course, we've had a lot of discussion and also different policies followed by different governments across the world and locally within the United States on whether or not to apply strict rules of enforcement with regard to wearing masks and social distancing and going out. There's been a lot of discussion about that. My own view is, now I'm in an age group that is particularly vulnerable. You see, those I'm in my 90s. I'm 94. I'm in that group over 85, which is particularly vulnerable. Well, I don't sit at home and do nothing. I go out, but I not only wear a mask, but since last March, I have worn a double mask. I didn't need to wait. In my simple-minded logic, I could, if one mask is good, two must be better. I didn't have to wait for the CDC to learn that it's a good idea to wear two masks. So I've been very careful. On the other hand, I would not want to enforce that kind of a rule on others, because I think it's not appropriate to do that. I would urge other people to be very cautionary. I would urge them to limit their risk, but they're free to make their own choice and their own mistakes. I'm protecting myself, and I feel comfortable, you see, in this kind of a world. And I think it becomes particularly important if we're going to maintain some of the ongoing economic activities that are essential. You know, we have food, transportation, and other essentials still have to be delivered, even though the inventories that used to support the restaurants to supply a lot of the food items have shifted now into homes, where we're now home more, and of course a lot of those have shifted into the homes. And but I've been impressed by the fact, although there's been times when we've had paper and food items disappear off shelves, those came back quite fast. And so the supply chains were really quite good. And I think this shows you this is the miracle of the pricing system at work, you see, which is decentralized. And those pricing signals tell you where you need, where the wheel needs oil and where it doesn't. And you have an automatic response to that. And it's very difficult to find any kind of comparable substitute for that if you're trying to do top-down planning, because those plans tend not to be informed by the kinds of information that's available at the private and individual level in markets.
In fact, I think you're absolutely right. The extended order has proved to be very robust even during the pandemic. You know, one is, of course, the supply chain aspect that you mentioned, but the other is also the fact that we have a vaccine within 11 months of, detection of the pandemic already being, injected into people's bodies. In fact, from what I understand, the vaccine was developed over a weekend through this massive global cooperation between different kinds of scientists. And this is probably one of the quickest examples in human history of how quickly we have a vaccination-based solution to a pandemic problem. So there, I think you're absolutely right. I want to move to another big theme in Adam Smith's world, and that is one of the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator is one really important theme in the theory of moral sentiments. And now we live in a very polarized world, especially if you spend a lot of time on the internet and social media. And people now have the ability to choose who are their intimate and extended orders over social media. And sometimes these intimate and even the extended orders can become very similar. They're very monocultural. They can almost turn into echo chambers. How do we think of the impartial spectator in this kind of polarized world where we can choose who we socialize with almost all of the time?
Well, Shruti, that's a hard question, but I do want to address it. Let me first, though, comment about what you said about the vaccines, how quick those have come forward. There is an invisible reason for that. And it's in the biotech industry. The biotech industry has built up a huge stock of knowledge about vaccines and about cures of all kinds of diseases. Many of these have origins, decades ago, and so that investment by private investors has created a biotech industry, which today we're getting that knowledge basically off the shelf. It took some some work to get through the approval processes, and it had to be informed by more testing. But the point is, that's the sort of thing that markets do, and that markets have already prepared for this. All right, now the impartial spectator. Now, you know, in the Ethereal Moral Sentiments, Smith, for a couple of dozen pages, uses the word spectator. And then he introduces what he calls the impartial spectator. Suddenly the spectator becomes something that he calls the impartial spectator. And then many pages later, after using the term impartial spectator, he refers to the fair and impartial spectator. Now, the reason why I call your attention to that, and for anyone who reads the Ethereal Moral Sentiments, and I heartily approve of and encourage you to do that, the fair and impartial spectator, I think, best represents what Adam Smith is always talking about when he talks about spectators and the impartial spectator. Because his world of rules that govern the social order, you see, are rules that are rules that are informed by these kinds of considerations. The impartial specter is a metaphor for how we come. See, first we come to know through the actions of other people that their view of us is not the same as our view of ourselves. And then at the next step in our maturation, we begin to take into account and see ourselves as others see us, you see, from that. And then finally, the step is for us to start to kind of modify our behavior so as to recognize that other people see us differently than ourselves. So that's kind of the process whereby, and Smith used the impartial spectator as a metaphor, you see, for how it is that we screen our own behavior, our own action. So it's be sensitive to the feelings and circumstances of others. And he used the word context and context specific a lot, because you see our experience is always in context as individuals. It's in a particular situation. You see, like in my example about the trash barrel, you see it came up in the context of a daily routine about moving trash barrels in and out from your house to the curb. And there, people are aware of, neighbors are aware of each other's basically accommodating that. And we help each other in simple, ordinary ways like that all of the time. So now, I think the thing about the challenge here to the impartial spectator is that we're having, in the world we're now living in, we're seeing a lot of divisiveness, a lot of anger, and with the response to anger, even a higher level of anger. Well, you see, that's getting out of the world of justice, where the in a sense, the punishment, the impartial spectator, you see, never wants to see the punishment either too great or too little. It has to be just right. And that, you see, comes back, I think, to this idea that negative reciprocity escalates. And And by the way, I'm using modern terms. You see, Smith doesn't talk about negative reciprocity. He occasionally uses the words reciprocity, but it's often a little different than the way we do it today. But the ideas, you see, in terms of this modern language, these are the ones that he is talking about. And I think this is an incredible challenge, you see, in this pandemic, and you see it particularly in our political lives. You see where not only does the anger escalate, but it spills over into violence, and of course the attempt to control things through social distancing, interestingly, has given us an escalation of household violence. So we get some of that, you see, on the inside in this intimate world that we live in. And I just found, you see, to me, the pandemic is in a way kind of a laboratory to think about what's going on the way Adam Smith would. And I have, to me, it's been really a fascinating kind of opportunity to observe what's going on in our society from the perspective of these principles that Adam Smith wrote about with such precision and deep understanding, you see, 260 years ago.
You know, one of the aspects when it comes to the impartial spectator is our engagement with society. It's really when one engages with society that the impartial spectator, in one sense, emerges or matures, because it cannot be developed in a vacuum, and it cannot be developed by someone like, say, the Mowgli character, right, from Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, who has never been in human society and has been raised by animals. But there is another element to the impartial spectator, which is very pertinent in the modern world, which is anonymity. So now we have an example where one is social, one does engage with other people, but does not reveal oneself. And I don't think there is an appropriate example in this in the Adam Smith world, because there weren't too many opportunities to engage socially while maintaining anonymity, other than maybe, letters to the editor or something like that. But there weren't many examples of that. Now, how does the impartial spectator guide action when we choose to remain anonymous? Or is part of choosing to remain anonymous sort of bypassing any judgment from our own impartial spectator or the world at large?
Well, I think it's simple to state, if difficult to achieve. And that is that interference with our normal communication has to become something that's part of the adaptation that we go through. If we're going to live at peace with our neighbors, you see. And of course, we don't always live at peace with our neighbors. And in fact, the Constitution was born in a period when there was a lot of tension and disruption. And somehow the framers did a great job in that, in many ways, divisive world, coming up with rules of stability, and those rules got seriously challenged in the years leading up to the Civil War. And in fact, you see, we were unable to peaceably settle the kind of deep conflicts that existed over the issue of slavery. And indeed, we didn't really, and then of course, discrimination remained after that war. And we didn't really begin to resolve it until 1954. you see, in the Topeka case in Kansas. That was the sort of a major beginning anew in grappling with discrimination issues on the basis of color. And we made, I think, enormous, progress since then, because that has become, now the impartial spectators have been modified so that on balance, there's a lot more accommodation. And in fact, it's astounding that from the First Amendment and the other articles in the Constitution, our freedoms have been enormously expanded, so that there's been a much better coming to terms with color, with gender, and also of sexual orientation, so that we have today, I think, a much more, not universally accepted, of course not, but a wide enough acceptance that freedom is something that every individual has a right to, and the form in which that takes place must be sensitive to that individual's preferences and circumstances. And we've had just, this incredible development. I know there's a lot of frustration among people who would like to see it advance more rapidly. And I understand that. I grew up, I was part of the, in the 40s, I was a member of, when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, I was a member of CORE, that's the Congress on Racial Equality. That was one of the early, very activist organization trying to push the boundaries of discrimination. I lived in Kansas, which was a northern state, so we didn't have Jim Crow laws, but we had widespread Jim Crow practices, you see, that were basically illegal, but the law wasn't being enforced. So, as a result of we did movie sit-ins, but in Chicago, the first sit-ins were in restaurants. And interesting, the manager calls and it's a group of mixed blacks and whites that are sitting in a booth in a restaurant. The manager calls the police. They come out, they say, well, there's no law being broken here. and so these sit-ins gradually broke that down, you see. So in my life, I've seen a huge advance over what I originally saw in the 30s. And I think that history is not evident, you see, to a lot of people that come in and they still see issues and problems. And we should recognize that there are still issues and problems, but also recognize that we have a process, you see, that has been working. And we need to nurture that process and move it forward, and not somehow destroy it in the hope that we can, out of those ashes, something better will arise.
This has been fascinating for me, because this entire time I have only been thinking about polarization in the news and media, or social media and so on. And here you've given us a concrete example of extreme polarization in physical spaces, right? I mean, whether you can sit in a restaurant booth together, or whether you can drink from the same tap, or use the same restroom, or use the same public transportation. And in some sense, it is very comforting to know that if we could surmount that kind of polarization over a period of time, then perhaps with better rules of conduct, we may be one day able to surmount the kind of polarization in the virtual world. But here I have a further question about Adam Smith's rules and norms, right?
Okay.
So all of the things that you talked about in the example of your sit-ins in Kansas restaurants was that you were trying to break down an existing social norm, which you believed was unjust. And there were others who joined in your effort. And over a period of time, there was a realization by, more widespread in society that this is unjust behavior, and perhaps people's individual impartial spectators evolved, and they said that we shouldn't ask people to leave a restaurant just because of racial lines or something like that. But that's an example where all kinds of people and ideas are mingling with one another. What happens in echo chambers on social media, where we are basically shutting out outside voices, and there is no easy example where there is a sit-in of a mixed group trying to break down a particular convention, because we've already chosen who we choose to engage with, and we have kept everyone else out.
Well, I find that very disturbing, because it seems to me that an important part of the process whereby rules change and adjust to different circumstances is that they're being nudged at the bottom, you see, by people who are saying, wait a minute, why do blacks in Wichita, Kansas have to go to the kitchen door and back? There's no law requiring that, as might be required under the Jim Crow laws. Why are we doing this, you see? And so, and the protest movement basically demonstrated that restaurant and movie owners don't have to worry about these things. It turns out people will accept them, you see, but there was fear that other people were making up the facts about what other people believed and would tolerate. And actually, with regard to rule adjustment, you see, the appropriate word is toleration. If you cannot tolerate dissent, you don't have a chance to learn about what the dissenters are talking about, you see. And so I think it's been an important part of the American experiment, has always been, you see, this willingness to try out different things and basically to go with what works, you see. And all aspects of the system has to be open to entry. See, entry of new, the essence of competition in markets is that they be open to entry. Incumbents in markets never like entrance. And in local professional qualification, certification laws, why, you see, incumbents are always would like it make it hard to start a new beauty salon or for a new plumber to get started and this sort of thing. So we have this tension constantly that we need to always work with to try to open up entry, and that's essential for wealth creation. It's essential in our social worlds for human social betterment, you see, and because these rules are not static. They can information, conditions, communication. There's innovation, the media, and this sort of thing, and so these rules have to adapt to these new circumstances, and we need to give them plenty of opportunity to adjust and not saddle them too much with top-down, you see, controls prohibiting certain things.
Absolutely. There's another new disturbing trend which aims towards justice, but there is something a little bit more, convoluted going on, which is the cancel culture that we are part of. And cancel culture, in short, is, for a particular wrong or even a perceived wrongdoing by somebody, this is usually in mainstream media or social media, a large number of people are very quick to judge them and to oppose that particular point of view. And they demand that, that particular individual steps down from their platform or gets fired from a job and so on and so forth. Now, if we think about Adam Smith and his world of reciprocal rules and feedback, in one sense, it's a good thing that, people provide feedback and people are actually, in some sense, trying to argue with one another on what is just or what is unjust. But on the other hand, one of the things that happens, perhaps because of the speed of social media, is a lot of virtue signaling, right? Sometimes people join the mob, which tends to be this anonymous large group that got together for a single purpose of this cancellation. And there's a lot of virtual signaling. And I think one reason is of this kind of online virtue signaling is because what is considered virtuous behavior is less clear nowadays. We don't have good guidelines for that, especially, for the younger millennials, where there's declining influence of religious rules, which are very strict. We don't know what it means to be virtuous anymore. So what can younger millennials learn from Adam Smith's insights about what is virtuous behavior?
Well, I think the first is that Adam Smith's emphasis is first upon process, origins, and motivation. And then the question is what has to do with the outcomes. And so, and I think a lot of these sort of protests involve anger over outcomes they see. And they're reacting against those outcomes. But the solution really has to come from a deep level, you see, and from the awareness of individuals of the consequences of their decisions, and being perhaps more sensitive to others in ways that in the past they haven't been. You see, it's about learning more about how others feel and how others see us, because that's, you see, it's that back and forth, and then learning to accommodate that's involved here. And so it seems the Smithian principles, I think, are alive and well. But it's a matter of how those principles can enable us to better adapt to the sorts of things that you're talking about and that we're experiencing here.
Is speed a problem when it comes to Smith's rules of conduct, that they must necessarily follow a slow process of evolution and the modern technologies just don't allow for that? Or the problem is not speed, but somewhere else?
Well, it's hard to separate this speed, and we see in the media now very quick. All of a sudden, everybody is informed of whatever an event was, and that sometimes fuels a violent protest. And then people virtual signal by being in agreement with that, because they recognize that the motivation, there's some unjust motivation that's coming from that, like for example, from the police force or whatever, you see. And then people jump to conclusions about how to control that outcome, and it may be completely inappropriate. You see, it may be you need more funds for the police, but the funds need to go into a change in police training and the forms, the way, and perhaps even the way we recruit people into police forces. So all of that needs to be re-examined and rebuilt, and otherwise, you see, the outcomes aren't going to change.
Yeah.
And if we continue to protest the outcomes, not liking those, well, then we end up in some form, and in some form or another, a type of war, which doesn't really address, you see, the processes that are going to give you the change.
And it's really interesting because, when you say fair and impartial spectator, I believe what Smith means by fair is not the outcomes. For Smith, at least in his time, the way the word fair was used was fair play or foul play, which is a matter of fairness of rules and fairness of processes as opposed to fairness of outcomes. Do you think that?
Right. Yeah. Oh, no. You see, in the 18th century, English, fair meant not foul.
Yes.
It had nothing to do with outcomes. Yeah. You see, and in fact, Smith's concept of justice, you see, we now talk about distributive justice. That has nothing to do with what Smith talked about in justice, because justice was about one thing and one thing only, and that was security from injury. Yeah. You see, security from injury and the rule of law, you see, in national economies is, first of all, concerned with security from injury. So we have laws that punish differentially murder, theft, robbery, violation of contract. There's a whole body of law, you see, that's intended to discourage, deter, you see, those kinds of behavior. Now, it's interesting, though, that on that, Smith is much more nuanced in terms of how he sees deterrence. He points out that in societies that had weak governments, suppose a young man is murdered by another young man and they catch the perpetrator. How was that resolved? You took the perpetrator to the family of the victim. And the question is, what did that family and what did the head of that family want to do? Well, he might call for the death penalty, but he might not. They may work out an accommodation in which the victim is compensated. You see, so it was a more flexible, whereas with modern governments, you see, it becomes, that's very transactions costly to solve every problem in that way. Easier in a small society where governments are fairly weak. And notice in those societies, governments are very concerned to keep the peace. So what they do not want is the victim's family now to give us a Hatfield and McCoy's world in which families are feuding. You see, they're trying to control that. Whereas in the modern state, you see, infractions like that become crimes against the public, not against a particular victim that everyone sympathizes with, and maybe might want to compensate. Instead, that sorts of behavior is punished, and we depend more on deterrence. But Smith was much more nuanced in the way he saw that. He was always open. You know, if the victim has to compensate, then that involves punishment, but it also restores, you see, the victim. Comes closer to making the victim whole. And is a way, a better way to accommodate, you see, these kinds of person-to-person violations of ordinary stable order.
I have another question on the Impartial Spectator that is coming from one of our listeners. This is Professor Vlad Darko at University of Arizona. And he wants to know what you think is the connection between Adam Smith's Impartial Spectator and the idea of the veil of ignorance, which is the Rawlsian idea, or the veil of uncertainty that Buchanan used.
Well, that's an interesting, very good question, and to me, a question is good. When I say a question is good, that's because I'm not sure what the answer is. But no, I think well, the veil of ignorance was, I think, for one thing, it was something of an intellectual exercise in which you imagine involving people in the decisions of punishment decisions without themselves knowing what their circumstance is going to be. So in a way, you're involving people, you see, in an exercise which allows sort of the fair and impartial spectator to play a role. So I think I would see in that, you see, a kind of an intellectual. It's kind of like a mental experiment in which we imagine policies being fashioned by neutral observers, neutral individuals, in which they can now begin to think in terms of kind of the more fundamental benefit-hurt sort of trade-off, independently of what they, you see, are going to feel as benefit or hurt in the world after they have grown up in it.
I think there is difficulty, though, between the two, because when Adam Smith is talking about the impartial spectator, it is a part of an evolutionary process where the impartial spectator matures along with the individual. And in some sense, the Buchanan and Rawls thought experiment requires one to imagine the same thing without that process. So in a sense, I don't know if it always helps you land in the same place.
Well, I think experiments are useful. In fact, one of my favorite one in Adam Smith, and it's sort of a parable in which he says, he asks you to imagine that a member of the species is brought up to maturity without ever having any contact with another member of the species. He says that person can no more know what it means for his mind to be deformed than for his face to be deformed. He says, bring him into society and you give him the mirror he needs, the mirror he wanted before. So there's this metaphor, you see, of the mirror whereby we come to see ourselves as others see us through and I think that parable, that mental experiment, you see, tells you why Adam Smith says that we are almost holy creations, you see, of social world, of others. And of course, the idea that Adam Smith was a champion of individualism directly contradicts this. I mean, I think he would be astonished that people think of him as a champion of individualism. The individual prospers and grows through its relationship with others, and that's the whole orientation of his system in the first book.
Absolutely. One of my favorite parables from Adam Smith, not far from yours, is when he's talking about how you share a joke with your friends. And, one thinks the joke is incredibly funny, but nobody else is laughing. And the sense,
yeah,
that one feels when others don't share in the same emotion, which is in this particular case, the same joke, is quite extreme, but also teaches a lesson on, rules of propriety and impropriety and social conduct.
Well, yes, and here's a simple proposition that I love, Adam Smith. He says people are much more anxious that their friends share their interests,
Yes.
that they share other friends. Think about that and apply it to the world we're living in now. In all of these outrages and virtual signaling that's going on, you see, and think about how the power of that proposition.
Absolutely. This was so wonderful. I think everything you know about Adam Smith, we cannot cover in an hour. So I encourage all our listeners, of course, to read Adam Smith in the original, both The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, but also the wonderful book that Professor Vernon Smith has written with Bart Wilson. It's called Humanomics, The Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations for the 21st Century. Thank you so much for doing this, Vernon. This was a pleasure.
Shruti, thank you. Thank you.